I guess you're the proverbial captive audience, but I hope there's something we can impart here. I was looking at the title of this session, Campaign Finance and Reapportionment, and I was scratching my head. How do you tie these two things together? They're kind of like apples and oranges, or maybe grapefruit and oranges down here, but they don't seem naturally to go together. You might have a workshop on one or workshop on the other, but tying them up into one neat package might take some doing, and we'll see if I can do it or not. But what these two topics together seem to represent are the ground rules, or the basic playing field of the 2012 campaign, both for president and also, I'd say, for Congress and other offices. And to these two topics, reapportionment and campaign finance, I would just add a third. That's kind of election administration, dealing with issues regarding voting. And this is something where Ann is an expert, and I'll turn it over to her to go into that more at the end. In all three areas, the situation has changed dramatically from 2008. Campaign finance over the years has been a generally tightly regulated system of contribution limits for candidates and political parties. That may not be the case, though, in 2012, because there was a Supreme Court decision in 2010 called Citizens United versus the Federal Election Commission, in which the Roberts Court basically removed limits on direct contributions from corporations and also labor unions and basically anyone else into the political process. Up to then, there are tight contributions in what you can give to a candidate. Basically, I believe it's $2,500 in a primary or a general election. You can give more to a political party, but there are still restrictions there. But if you're giving to these outside groups now, who have set up groups called super PACs, PACs meaning political action committees, they will take all the money you want to give them, and they will spend all the money that they can take in. And they can send out a message on behalf of a candidate that candidate doesn't have any say over. Because one of the basic caveats of the way the system is set up now is that these outside groups cannot coordinate their message with the candidates or the parties. They have to do it independently, so in some respects they may be doing the candidate some good, in some respects they might do it some ill. But we'll see how that goes, in the months ahead. We're still on the cusp of it. But it's turned what was a rather straightforward government-regulated system into a Wild West show. Practically anything goes. We've gone back into a much more laissez-faire era when it comes to campaign finance. One thing I think we can say with a fair amount of certainty is more money will be spent in the 2012 election than ever before. I saw an early estimate of $6 billion, probably what the price tag may be. Now, I think you can argue this one up or down as to whether that's, what is $6 billion? Is that a lot of money or not a lot of money these days? It's kind of in the eyes of the beholder. I think if you spent $6 billion on the highways around Orlando, you'd still need more money. You wouldn't get the job done with $6 billion. I know up where I live in Northern Virginia, one interchange connecting two interstate highways has cost about $1 billion. So in that respect, $6 billion isn't a whole lot. But when you put it into the political world, there's only so much money you can spend in a particular campaign without having voters tune you out in disgust because you're messing with their ears. They've heard enough. You've oversaturated the market. You can spend too much. So in that sense, and given the fairly limited number of campaigns that we have going at one time, $6 billion can be a lot of money. At first glance, this court ruling would seem to have provided the Republicans and their business allies with a great advantage. However, the Democrats have gotten better at raising money. They have their financial angels of their own, such as George Soros, and they also have, in Barack Obama, probably the greatest fundraiser of all time. He collected $750 million alone when he was running for president in 2008, and there's talk that he might spend a full $1 billion in his effort to win re-election in 2012. Now, one of the casualties of all of this change in the campaign finance system, is that public financing, which is one of the staples of presidential campaigns from the Watergate era, when Richard Nixon was forced from office back in 1974 till early this century. Public financing now looks like it almost has a stake driven through its heart. It's a question whether any candidate will take it in the primary, let alone the general election this year. And I think the death knell of it has been that it's, one, the contribution limit stayed very low. There were limits on how much a presidential candidate could raise and qualify for public funding in the primary or general election. The spending limits were very low. They weren't updated really to reflect the modern levels of spending. And taxpayer support in the form of that checkoff. I don't know if you're filling out, I guess you're not filling out income taxes yet, but there's a checkoff form there near the top of the form, and whether you want, I guess it's $3 now of your of what you're paying to the federal government to go into this public financing fund. And 30 or so years ago, about maybe 30% of Americans were checking that box. More recently, it's down to less than 10%. There is basically no public support for it, and Republicans, I think, at this point in time, being virtually, anti-government, I'd be surprised if any Republican presidential candidate would take it. It would be outside the ideological mainstream of the party these days. Now, in pivoting over to reapportionment and redistricting, well, I should say reapportionment, I have to bring up redistricting at the same time, because these two words are almost invariably linked together. Reapportionment is the number of seats that each state gets, and I'm talking the congressional level now, that each state gets based on the last census. And so we're talking about the census in 2010. The nation has reapportionment every 10 years. The changes are being made now. I think in the state of Florida, they're in the midst of the redistricting process, and the new lines will go into effect in 2012 and presumably will stay in effect through 2020. Now, redistricting, though, is the redrawing of district lines within the states to reflect the number of seats that a state now has. And they have to reflect almost down to the exact number, the concept of one man, one vote. There can be no population variance from one district to another. And in Florida, there will be 27 congressional seats next year. All of them, the plan has to have them all stay within a handful, if not exactly the same in population, within a handful of people. It's really a ludicrous standard if you look at it. The courts are much more generous with state legislatures and apportioning state legislatures and saying we'll allow you some variance in population, but in terms of House seats, no. They want it right down to the digit. And it's ludicrous because they're taking numbers from April 2010, when the census was taken. I mean, there's already been population change since then. But this is the one kind of verity that they insist on. Everything else, it's kind of anything goes. If you look at the congressional district maps, if you look at the current one of Florida, for example, it looks like, in some places, it looks like impressionistic artwork. you have districts. Well, you have one district here, the 3rd district, represented by Corn Brown, that starts up north of Jackson, jags its way down to Gainesville, then makes a turn and comes down west of Orlando. And it isn't even as smooth as I'm depicting it. You know, that you can have districts of any shape. I mean, it's a far cry from the old days, I guess, when maybe when Lou was back in Congress or before that, when basically you shape districts around whole counties. You tried not to divide counties when you put together congressional districts, but then they didn't have to worry about population equality. And you could have one district, say, here in Orlando with 800,000 citizens in it, and then you could have one up in the, down in the middle of the state there where there's not many people living, and maybe with 200,000 people in it, and they'd each have one representative. But that's not allowed anymore. One man, one vote. Now, if I could pivot back to reapportionment a second. This has dual meaning, really. Reapportionment applies both to presidential elections and to congressional elections. Because the electoral vote is determined by the number of House seats a state gets, plus its 2 senators. So Florida, in the 2012 election, will have 27 House seats. It'll get 2 more senators. That'll be 29 electoral votes. And that will actually make it the 3rd largest state in terms of its electoral vote total, tied with New York, and behind Texas and California. It's interesting, though, the reapportionment of seats over the last generation has followed a north to south migration, frost belt to sun belt, and if you just take 2 states, kind of epitomize, what's happened here, Florida and New York. Back after World War II, in the late 1940s, Florida had 6 House seats, New York had 45. Next year, Florida will have 27 House seats, New York will have 27 House seats. And that's kind of epitomized a type of shift in the seats that we've had in recent times. The election, as I said, we don't elect people by the popular vote. As if you remember the election of 2000, the popular vote winner in this country usually also wins the electoral vote, but not always wins the electoral vote. We go by the electoral vote, and there are 538 of them divided between the 50 states and the District of Columbia. Currently, 48 states give all of their electoral votes to the winner of that, the person who won the state in the popular vote. As Obama did here in 2008, he won all of the electoral votes. 2 states use a different system. They give 1 electoral vote to the winner in each congressional district. That's plus 2 electoral votes to the winner of the statewide vote. They're 2 small states, Maine and Nebraska. And in Nebraska the last time, Obama actually lost the state big, but he won narrowly the district that includes Omaha, so he won 1 electoral vote under this system out of Nebraska. Why do I say this? Because Pennsylvania now is thinking of changing from the winner-take-all system to this system of dividing by congressional districts. And if the election is close, that could make a huge difference. The impetus for this is not coming from the Democrats, because the Democrats have won 5 straight presidential elections in Pennsylvania. It comes from the Republicans, who recently gained control in 2010 of the state legislature and of the governorship, and now have the power to make changes, as any state could if they wanted to change how they awarded the electoral votes. And Pennsylvania is thinking of this district system, which the race is very close. It could have a tremendous impact if Pennsylvania actually followed through and did this, because it would take away about 10 votes 10 electoral votes from the winning candidate and give the losing candidate 10 electoral votes. But the Republicans, if they tried this, would actually be too cute by half, possibly, because probably in 2012 they have their best chance of carrying Pennsylvania and many of these other battleground states than they have in years. But I'd leave you with the thought here that the two elections have consequences, whether it's a presidential election or whether it's a midterm election. And many of the things that are happening now, which have changed the playing field for 2012, which are changing the ground rules, are an outgrowth of the Republican success in the last midterm elections. It gave them control of the state governments across the country, a number of states across the country. It's enabled them to control congressional redistricting in a number of states, not in a manner that they will probably gain seats in 2012, but that they've enhanced their chances of consolidating their majorities in the House of Representatives because they're able to create safer seats for many of the people they've newly elected. Also, they've been able to go out after some of the Democratic interest groups. I don't know if you were following at all the situation in Wisconsin or Ohio earlier this year, in which Republican governors and state legislatures went after the organized labor, particularly over collective bargaining rights for state employees, and succeeded in curtailing these rights, and in the process created a situation that we'll see. I mean, I think one of the byproducts of this that the Republicans hope is that it'll reduce the clout ultimately of organized labor, which is one of the biggest allies that the Democrats have. Also, some of the Republican-controlled states have taken a close look at voting participation and how easy or difficult to make it for actually young people and minorities. And it seems like in Florida, it's a model for this in terms of cutbacks in the length of the early voting period that looks for 2012, and also restrictions on third-party groups like the League of Women Voters to register new voters. This affects you. It could affect you if you're going to be 18 by November 2012. It doesn't look like it'll be as easy to register or to vote in Florida than it was just several years ago. So with that, I will turn it over to Ann Hellmuth, who is the expert on these matters, and can take it from there.
Thank you very much. I don't know about being an expert, but I'll certainly do my best. First of all, I just wanted to tell you what the League of Women Voters is all about, because probably some of you think it's sort of one of those stuffy organizations and probably just your grandmother or great-grandmother was interested in. Actually, it was started in 1920 by a bunch of really tough ladies. They were the suffragettes, or suffragists as they call them in this country, who had fought for decades and decades to get women to vote. And once it seemed as if the 19th Amendment that would give women the vote was about to pass, they organized themselves into the League of Women Voters so that they could continue their work by having influence on policy, investigating into issues and adopting them, and then going ahead and sort of arguing on behalf of them. And they have continued to do that down through the ages, or it seems like ages to many of you. Actually, I had a mother and a grandmother that were born during that time and who were born long before women got the vote. But anyway, I just wanted to tell you what that's all about. So the League, we do not support any candidates at all. What we do is we help to educate people about elections. We send out flyers, tell them who the candidates are. We don't say they're good, bad, or indifferent. And we, we used to be able to register people to vote. But this year, the legislature, in its infinite wisdom, went ahead and passed this elections bill. HB 1355. One lot of numbers that I found very easy to remember, even with my aging brain. It's a sweeping 158-page elections bill, and it definitely makes it harder for voters to register and to cast a ballot in Florida. Among the things, I mean, even though they got 16,000 calls and emails asking the governor, Scott, to veto the measure, he signed it and it went into law. So prepare yourselves in 2012. Here are some of the things that it's doing, a little bit more expansion on what my friend here mentioned. Not only are they cutting the number of hours or days that you can actually, the early voting will be available, and if you remember in 2008, there were long lines at the early voting stations for people who wanted to, or were either going to be out of town or didn't want to be caught up in the long lines on election day. So they've been cut in half. Instead of 96 hours, we have 96 hours in 8 days now. Or it may be actually 48 hours in 8 days, because fully half of the number of days and hours previously required, they are busy cutting those. During the 2008 election, lines for early voting was so long that Governor Charlie Crist issued an emergency directive to extend polling place hours in order to ease voters' wait times. Now with this new law, you can reckon it'll be even worse. And if anybody was on campus here in 2008, you know what the lines were here like for UCF students to go and vote. People stood in line for hours and well into the evening, long after polls in other parts had closed. But that won't be a possibility now. If you'll also have trouble registering before you could change your address and vote at the place where you were living, and even if you weren't previously registered there, you won't be able to do that now. You're going to have to register early, and you can't just sort of wake up one morning and say, I'm going to vote on election day if you haven't gone and registered beforehand. These are just some of the things that are going to affect you and which you really need to be aware of, because your generation made a huge difference in 2008. It'll make a huge difference in 2012 if everybody gets out there and votes. And, you know, without voting, you don't have a voice. And this is what we in the League feel very strongly about. The other big thing is that for 71 years in Orange County, Florida, the Florida League of Women Voters has helped people register to vote. After the passage of this bill, it was decided that we could no longer do that. And the reason why is because this bill imposes fines on people who collect voter registrations, and don't turn them in within a 48-hour period. Previously, it was a 10-day period. The feeling was that it was too much liability to put on volunteers because they wouldn't find the organization, they'd find you individually. So you might get caught up, couldn't drop the ballots off within the 48-hour period, and you could be facing a nice few $100 fine. And so the League is not doing that. We are challenging those in the court, but obviously I think the election will come and go before that's probably decided. Now on to the redistricting. This is one battle where we've had some success this year. First of all, and it's nice to have a success, we campaigned for 30 years to get an amendments on the Florida, as part of the Florida Constitution, which would stamp out gerrymandering. Now, I, being married to a German and having grown up in England when we used the word gerry very derogatively, always thought gerrymandering had something to do with Germans. I don't know why. But I just found out today that in 1812, actually, there was a guy called Elridge, Jerry, and he drew a district for himself which was shaped like a salamander. And forever after, that's how gerrymandering got its name. Well, gerrymandering is the term for drawing these districts. The one that Mr. Cook referred to, which Corinne Brown has, which is District 3, and it snakes, literally. It's just, it practically goes, on one side of the road and not the other that it goes down. the feeling we have had for decades is that this isn't fair to the constituents. Constituents need to know who represents them. They need to be in a consecutive place. They need to be, counties shouldn't be split up into many districts or cities. Winter Park, for instance, which I think has a population of about 30,000, is split up into 4 congressional districts. And there's no sense to these sort of things. So we joined with an organization called Fair Districts, and we campaigned hard. It meant going out and collecting well over 1 million signatures, which all had to be certified to get the amendments 5 and 6 on the ballot. 5 is for legislative seats, 6 is for congressional seats. And once they were on the ballot, that wasn't the end of it either. The Florida legislature tried to get another one on the ballot, Amendment 7, which would have negated what 5 and 6 did. Voters get confused enough anyway. They would have been totally confused over what these 3 things were doing. Fortunately, the courts threw out 7 and left 5 and 6, and 63% of voters voted for Amendments 5 and 6. So, you think you've won, huh? Well, not yet. The Florida legislature, they're the ones that are going to draw these districts, and they have put aside money in which they have legally, it's their prerogative, they have gone into court to fight the fair districts. They have supported people who have opposed fair districts. In the case of Amendment 6, Corinne Brown and a South Florida legislator, Diaz-Balart, opposed it on the grounds that it was going to make it almost impossible for minorities to be elected. That was thrown out by a federal judge, and so at the moment the amendments are standing and should be in place in 2012. Now, the redistricting is based on the census figures. Every 10 years we have a census, and every 10 years various legislatures redraw the districts. So this summer, the legislature put together a panel of House and Senate members, and they toured the state. They had something like 26 public hearings, in which they originally they told the lawmakers on the panels that they were to say nothing at these hearings. They were to sit there sort of mute throughout, while people like the League of Women Voters, the NAACP, the ACLU, many other organizations, teachers' organizations, spoke up and asked them to be sure that they honored the voters, and they did what the voters asked when it came to drawing the new districts. Some of them, one of the hearings I testified at, he was busy reading his his little Facebook or something, and having a little laugh and nudging someone else. I can imagine that after a while, you sit there and listen to the same people saying the same thing, it does get rather sort of mind-numbing. But at least you could sort of put a good show on it. So anyway, these hearings went on. The League's position was that it was up to the lawmakers to draw the maps. That's their job. That's what they get paid for. Wasn't up to the League to draw the maps. It was to ask them to draw the maps. The lawmakers' thing was argument was that the League should draw the maps and basically shut up and go away. We didn't shut up and go away. We went to every single hearing. We had many supporters that came out at the hearings. One of the other things that we were trying to get was the timetable. The timetable is very important. You don't really stop and think about these things. But the legislature next year will meet in January rather than March because they can only approve the new districts in the 2012 year. But they can do the planning beforehand so the public can see what they're thinking about and have input. That wasn't going to happen. They were going to actually start the planning in January, which means by the end of the legislative session in March, you might get final proposals. There are appeals that have to be done afterwards, which take up more than 60 days. So what you were risking here was that people would have to file to run for office, and they wouldn't know what their district was. So the League fought very, very hard to have the legislature speed it up. There was a lot of sort of, name throwing, and, they sort of didn't take too kindly to the League. And certainly there was no complimentary words going around. But then, was on last week, we get to the point where suddenly Senator Don Getz, and we applaud him for doing this, announced an accelerated redistricting timetable, which targets December 5 as the committee's deadline for finalizing new district maps. That moves it up a good 4 to 5 weeks of what was possibly where they would have begun before under the old timetable. It makes a huge difference. It shows that they were listening. It shows that it pays to go out and be a big mouth sometimes. And it really, made us have confidence in our lawmakers. We really salute Don Getz for doing that. And we wish more lawmakers had listened to us on lots of other things too. Maybe husbands as well would be good to have them listen to us occasionally. So that's where we stand on the legislature, on the redistricting at the moment. November's a big month. They're going to the House. The State House will be finalizing plans and getting things together. The last public proposals will be in. There's something like 69 public proposals that have been put forward. But what really counts is what the lawmakers do, and probably have been doing for quite some while, although nobody has seen anything and nobody knows about it. So it just goes to show that if you get up and shout your mind, and you're on firm ground on your position, that you can win in even some of the toughest circumstances. Now we just have to wait and see what they come up with, but we're hopeful. So thank you very much.
Passage of an equal rights amendment would affect gerrymandering and the election bill that was passed by Florida?
The Equal Rights Amendment in what sense?
If they passed an equal rights amendment to give males and females equal rights, would it affect the election bill that made it so hard for women and minorities to be registered?
Well, it's not just women and minorities, it's men too, and everybody is going to be hard for people to register. So I don't think that would have made a difference. I mean, I just think it's going to be, it's a tough election law, and it's, obviously its supporters have their reasons, and but it's going to make it very, very difficult for everybody who's not organized and not aware of what's going on. I mean, you just have to really be plugged in the next to
Mrs. Hellmuth,
yeah.
You said that under the new legislature passed that it's going to be harder to register to vote in the state of Florida. Would that affect anyone who registered under the Motor Voter Act? Anybody who's already pre-registered?
It'll affect everybody that's pre-registered if they move. Supposing you registered when you were living at home with your parents, and then you come to college, and you haven't thought about changing your address and re-registering. You were able to do it on election day. You could turn up at the poll where you were living, and you could, fill in the forms and do it then. But this, you will not be able to. You have to do it earlier than that now. So it will affect you in that sense. It's.
The attempt to make the attempt to make it more difficult for young people to vote in this state of Florida, could that be motivated by an attempt to favor one party over the other? We remember last time it was said that Central Florida made a difference in the 2008 Florida vote, presidential vote, and it's basically the young people, particularly UCF students, who voted in large numbers for Barack Obama. Are we dealing with an attempt by the state legislature to preempt this kind of situation in the future? And that's a question for you.
I'm sorry. Well, I'm certain that there's some motivation towards that. I mean, after all, we have a Republican majority in the House and in the Senate in Florida, and I can see that that was possibly be a motivating force. But in fairness, they're not the only ones that have done it. The Democrats did it too when they had the chance. They just don't have the chance at the moment.
Do you believe that the Electoral College system as it is, the argument is that the current one does defend states' rights, but do you really believe that now in, the present time it still serves that purpose?
Are you thinking about it in terms of states' rights here, or just in general, does the Electoral College serve a purpose?
Well, like back in, in the day, kind of,
Yes.
back when it was conceived, there was more
Yes.
sectionalism, but do you think
Yes.
that it's realistically there's going to be more an approach towards like Nebraska and Maine's electoral system, or do you think that the Electoral College system is going to stay as it is?
Well, that's a good question. It's evolved at a glacial pace. I mean, but you're right. It's a vestige of our our founding days. We had the Electoral College first, then the popular vote kind of began to fold in about 40 years later. There wasn't any popular vote up till about 1824. It was totally the Electoral College, and Lou has written eloquently about it in some of his recent commentaries, and I would refer you to them. I think it's a question now in our democracy, would we do better by having just a strict popular vote and going by that and say doing away with the Electoral College, or do we keep the Electoral College and with the knowledge that it sometimes can elect a candidate who hasn't won the popular vote, as was the case in 2000. Now, I will confess, one of my biggest surprises as a political reporter came back in 2000 when Al Gore won the popular vote by more than 500,000 votes, but of course all the emphasis was on Florida and the hanging chads and everything like that. But Bush emerged the winner by 5 electoral votes. And nobody seemed to protest the fact that, hey, isn't this a little odd for a major democracy, to have this old system, overruling the popular vote. I thought, though, that once that happened, because it had not happened previously until way back in the late 1800s, did we have such a thing called the Electoral College misfire, is basically what it's called. But we hadn't had it in over 100 years, and I thought the first time we had something like that in modern times, there'd be such a national outcry from people that the Electoral College would be gone in an instant. Well, there's hardly any outcry at all about it, and there's very rarely any reference to that fact that there was such a misfire that occurred. Now, it's my contention that if it was reversed, if Al Gore had won the electoral vote and George W. Bush had won the popular vote, Al Gore would have been elected, that the Republicans, particularly those on talk radio, cable TV, would have gone crazy. And then you might have seen a movement within the states to repeal the Electoral College. But the Democrats did not make an issue out of it. And so the same system goes on. Now, there's something out there, I'll just add, obviously you've hitting a button here for me. There's this thing called the National Popular Vote movement that is out there that is trying to get states to change their electoral vote system so that they don't vote for the will of their own state's voters, but they apply the will of the national voters. So if here in Florida you voted for the Republican candidate next year, but the Democrat won nationally, the electoral votes, if Florida bought into that system, would go to the Democrat, or D.C. might 90% Democratic. If the Republican won nationally, its electoral votes would go for the Republican. And to me, I would just say, well, I really hate that idea. I think it's just gaming the system. If you don't like the Electoral College, move to get rid of the Electoral College, but don't try to game it or tinker around the edges like that. But I think having electoral votes by district is a worthy alternative that states can look at if they want to.
Politicians, especially conservatives, have been pushing for voter identification, but most of the proposed voter identification, like passports, costs money to get. in essence, doesn't that reinstate a poll tax where you have to have some amount of money in order to vote under the voter identification, which shouldn't be a law with the 24th Amendment?
Good question.
There you go again. I think you've stated it. I think you've stated a legitimate point of view. The Republicans argue, or the conservatives argue, that you can have a lot of voter fraud, I think is their contention, if you don't have a pictorial ID. But I don't know, is it your judgment that they do not accept a driver's license, though? A photo on a driver's license is not enough?
Some have said that would be okay, but some have been pushing for more than that.
Well, I think it's mostly they accept a driving license. I didn't know that they accepted. I mean, I think your driving license is more likely to get accepted than your passport in some cases.
I wonder here if we don't have a case of conservatives going back to their roots. For the longest of time, one of the differences between liberals and conservatives were about the preferred size of the electorate, with conservatives trying to constrain the electorate. But at least since the 1950s, or at least since the 1960s, the conservatives have accepted a large electorate, and they've done very well with the election of Reagan and several Republican presidents and so on and so on and so on. And now I notice that there is this movement pushed by the conservative movement in the country to bring in a certain restriction of the electorate against minorities and young people. And it's a little bit to me like the conservatives going back to their historical, long-forgotten roots.
Well, I just want to say I had a really good quote here. At the time when the elections bill was had been passed, and the League was announcing that it was no longer going to register voters, a state senator, Mike Bennett from Bradenton, lamented, "How much more convenient do you want to make voting? This is a hard-fought privilege, something people died for." He said, and we agree that the right to vote is worth dying for, and obviously we would fight to the death to defend it, but do we have to make it inconvenient for people to vote? I mean, shouldn't we? And here we have a lawmaker saying, how much more convenient do you want to make it? I mean, I think that is, was a typical of the attitude of some of the people that voted for the elections bill.
I might add one point. I don't know if we're...
in 1 minute, because we need to disband.
Yes. I think I would say one good thing about this period of history that we're living in, and that's that nobody can raise the point which George Wallace raised back in the 1968 campaign, that the two parties are Tweedledum and Tweedledee. There's no difference between them. You could elect a Democrat, you'd elect a Republican. He argued you get the same thing. Many people agreed with him. Now, if you elect a Democrat or you elect a Republican, you're making a big choice. You have a choice. And I think that's one of the valuable aspects, maybe one of the few valuable aspects of this polarized politics, is it isn't mushy anymore. It's very clear-cut, and it's very high stakes. So get out there and register.
All right, thank you.
People.